Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And yesterday we got to page 26, so we just started chapter 2, but here's the picture from chapter 1, just to give you a little reminder. So only Lucy and Edmund and this guy, Eustace Clarence, who's annoying, not very mature. They weren't looking forward to visiting him, but they were, and they saw a picture on the wall of a ship, and it looked very Narnian to Lucy, so she loved it and was gazing at it, and Eustace was making fun of her for liking it. Well, they all noticed it started to look very much alive, and sure enough, the picture sucked them right in. And they found themselves in the ocean, flopping about. The people on board threw them a rope and got them back on the ship, or up on the ship. And whose ship was it but Prince Caspian's? So there is Prince Caspian, Edmund, Lucy, and this is Eustace Clarence. And if you'll remember, Eustace was hating it because his experience on ships was only seasickness. So then we were reintroduced to our friend Reepicheep, the mouse, and they were given a tour of the ship. Lucy will be staying in Prince Caspian's cabin, which she loved, because back when she was a queen, she did a lot of traveling on ships, and this just made her so happy. So here we are in chapter 2, on board the Dawn Treader, and look very closely at the dragon's mouth. You can see there's a human on the inside looking through a looking glass, a telescope. And then here is Reepicheep over here. And remember, Eustace was very surprised to meet Reepicheep, because Eustace is a typical human who knows nothing about Narnia. And the creatures, the animals, and all the other creatures are much larger than a typical mouse, for example, back home in England, but they're also talking animals, right? So Eustace is just not having a good time. All right, so Eustace is in bed. Lucy, let me let somebody in. Lucy, Edmund, and Prince Caspian are having a conversation. And they have met. One of the newer characters is Prince Caspian's captain, who is Captain Drinian. All right, so I'm going to back up just a little bit. Let's see, the Lord Roop. Let's back up a little. Okay, so Edmund and Lucy wanted to know, if to them, the last time they were in Narnia was just a year ago before they got sucked back into Narnia. And Edmund said to Prince Caspian, "It's about a year ago by our time since we left you. It was just before your coronation." Coronation means he was blessed and recognized for being king of Narnia. Okay. "How long has it been in Narnia years?" "Exactly 3 years," said Caspian. "Is all going well?" asked Edmund. "Well, you don't suppose I'd have left my kingdom and put out to sea unless all was well," answered the king. "It couldn't be better." "Oh, I'm sorry. If you're reading along with me, We are at the top of page 20 right now. And like I said, we left off on 26. So I may jump ahead there, but I just wanted you to hear this part. So he went on to explain that he left his kingdom with the dwarf Trumpkin. Okay. And Lucy was saying, oh, you couldn't have made a better choice. He is so loyal and such a great guy. And he had been going to say, let's see. And where are we headed for? What are we headed for? Asked Edmund. Well, said Caspian, that's a rather long story. Perhaps you remember that when I was a child, my usurping uncle Miraz got rid of 7 of my father's friends who might have taken my part, meaning who might have defended him if they had been there. And that's why Miraz sent them off. He sent them off to explore unknown eastern seas beyond the lone islands. Yes, said Lucy, and none of them ever came back. Right. Well, on my coronation day, with Aslan's approval, I swore an oath that if once I established peace in Narnia, I would sail east for myself for a year and a day to find my father's friends or to learn of their deaths and avenge them if I could. These were their names. I'm going to write these down later, so let me put a little marker here. These were their names: Lord Revilian, Lord Byrne, Lord Argos, Lord Mavramorn, Lord Octesian, Lord Restamar, and oh, there's that other one that's hard to remember. The Lord Roop, sire, said Drinian. Roop, of course, said Caspian. That is my main intention. But Reepicheep here has higher hope. Everyone's eyes turned to the mouse. As high as my spirit, it said, though perhaps as small as my stature. Why should we not come to the very eastern end of the world? And what might we find there? I expect to find Aslan's own country. It is always from the east across the sea that great lion comes to us. I say, that is an idea, said Edmund in an awed voice. But do you think, said Lucy, Aslan's country would be that sort of country? I mean, the sort you could ever sail to? I do not know, madam, said Reepicheep, but there is this. When I was in my cradle, a wood woman, a dryad, spoke this verse over me. Where sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet. Doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all you seek. There is the utter east. So to find all you seek, to find everything you want and everything you want to know, there is the utter east. I do not know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life. All right, so this is what all they were talking about. And Caspian, yeah, so they've gone on, while they've been on the boat, they've stopped at a few different places. And their goal is to get to the Lone Islands. And after the Lone Islands, no one knows. No one has ever gone beyond those. And that's scary when you're on a ship because of water, especially, but food and just needing to dock somewhere, right? Okay. Okay, and let's get to let's just start where we left off, and we'll look back if we have any questions. So on page 26, the first full chapter. You and I must lodge here, Edmund, said Caspian. We'll leave your kinsman the bunk and sling hammocks for ourselves. Here's the picture of where they are. So what they've already discovered is these are very dark, stinky quarters. I don't know if it's focusing very well. And Lucy has Prince Caspian's quarters. And you can see, because her clothes were all wet, all she can wear are his clothes. And there's Edmund. Okay, actually, I'm not sure, so we'll just read. Okay, I beseech your majesty, said Drinian. No, no, shipmate, said Caspian. We have argued that out already. You and Brince was the mate, are sailing the ship, and will have cares and labors many a night when we are singing catches or telling stories, so he must have the port cabin above. King Edmund and I can lie very snug here below. But how is the stranger? They're talking about Eustace. So the conversation is just that the workers are given the better quarters because they need to be alert and rested. And Caspian is saying, look, we're going to be telling stories and having a great time. We can sleep in the hammocks, right? Eustace, very green in the face, scowled and asked whether there was any sign of the storm getting less. But Caspian said, what storm? And Drinian burst out laughing. Storm, young master, he roared. This is as fair a weather as a man could ask for. Who's that? Said Eustace irritably. Send him away. His voice goes through my head. Remember, Eustace is whiny, but he's also very seasick. Not a good feeling. I've brought you something that will make you feel better, Eustace, said Lucy. Oh, go away and leave me alone, growled Eustace. But he took a drop from her flask, and though he said it was beastly stuff, the smell in the cabin when she opened it was delicious. It is certain that his face came the right color a few moments after he swallowed it, and he must have felt better because instead of wailing about the storm in his head, he began demanding to be put ashore and said that at the first port he would lodge a disposition against them all with the British Council. But when Reepicheep asked what a disposition was and how you lodged it, Reepicheep thought it was some new way of arranging a single combat, meaning a fight. Eustace could only reply, fancy not knowing that. In the end, they succeeded in convincing Eustace that they were already sailing as fast as they could toward the nearest land they knew, and that they had no more power of sending him back to Cambridge, which was where Uncle Harold lived, than of sending him to the moon. After that, he sulkily agreed to put on the fresh clothes which had been put out for him and come out on deck. Caspian now showed them over the ship, though indeed they had seen most of it already. They went up on the forecastle and saw the lookout man standing on a little shelf inside the gilded dragon's neck and peering through its open mouth. Okay, I'll show you that picture again. That was at the beginning of chapter 2. Okay. You see him in there? I'm sorry, it's so blurry. Okay. Inside the forecastle was the galley or ship's kitchen and quarters for such people as the boatswain, the carpenter, the cook, and the master archer. If you think it odd to have the galley and the bows, and imagine the smoke from its chimney streaming back over the ship, that is because you are thinking of steamships, where there is always a headwind. On a sailing ship, the wind is coming from behind, and anything smelly is put as far forward as possible. They were taken up to the fighting top, and at first it was rather alarming to rock to and fro there and see the deck looking small and far away beneath. You realized that if you fell there was no particular reason why you should fall on board rather than in the sea. All right. I don't see a picture of what they're talking about. The fighting deck. I think it's that thing way up in the top. But we'll see a picture of that soon. Then they were taken to the poop, where Prince was on duty with another man at the great tiller, and behind that the dragon's tail rose up, covered with gilding.
Is that the
muted? Oh, yeah, that's coming up. Yeah, that's coming up. Behind that, the dragon's tail rose up, covered with gilding, and round inside it ran a little bench. The name of this ship was Dawn Treader. She was only a little bit of a thing compared with one of our ships, or even with the cogs, dromons, carracks, and galleons, which Narnia had owned when Lucy and Edmund had reigned there under Peter as the High King. For nearly all navigation had died out in the reigns of Caspian's ancestors. All right, Liz, if you want to hold that up for people to see, I will spotlight you. Okay. Maybe a little closer to the. Yeah, it's okay.
Answer.
Oops.
Is a collar grenade.
We're recording the conversation at your house, Liz. Yeah, mute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
It's all right. Okay. Thank you, hon. Thank you. Okay, let me remove that spotlight, and there we go. Thanks, Liz. Okay. And let me spotlight me. Sorry about that. All right. Okay. Let me show you. Let me see if I can fill the screen a little better with that. Usually what they do are some of these pictures where they show a little glimpse of each thing that they're talking about, but it's really tough to see, I think. So if I can take a picture of it later and get it clear and defining, I will. Okay, so she was only a little bit of a thing compared with one of our ships, or even with the cogs, dromons, carracks, and galleons, which Narnia had owned when Lucy and Edmund had reigned there under Peter as the High King. For nearly all navigation had died out in the reigns of Caspian's ancestors. When his uncle Miraz, the usurper, had sent the 7 lords to sea, they had had to buy a Galmian ship and man it with hired Galmian sailors. But now Caspian had begun to teach the Narnians to be seafaring folk, meaning sea traveling folk, once more. And the Dawn Treader was the finest ship he had built yet. She was so small that forward of the mast, there was hardly any deck room between the central hatch and the ship's boat on one side and the hen coop, Lucy fed the hens, on the other. But she was a beauty of her kind and a lady, as sailors say, her lines perfect, her colors pure, and every spar and rope and pin lovingly made. Eustace, of course, would be pleased with nothing and kept on boasting about liners and motorboats and aeroplanes and submarines, as if he knew anything about them, muttered Edmund. But the other 2 were delighted with the Dawn Treader, and when they returned aft to the cabin and supper and saw the whole western sky lit up with an immense crimson sunset, and felt the quiver of the ship, and tasted the salt on their lips, and thought of unknown lands on the eastern rim of the world, Lucy felt that she was almost too happy to speak. What Eustace had thought best be told in his own words, For when they all got their clothes back, dried the next morning, he at once got out a little black notebook and a pencil and started to keep a diary. He always had this notebook with him, and he kept a record of his marks in it, for though he didn't care much about any subject for its own sake, he cared a great deal about marks and would even go to people and say, "I got so much, what'd you get?" By marks, they mean grades. That's in England, they refer to grades as marks. But as he didn't seem likely to get many marks on the Dawn Treader, he now started a diary. This was the first, sorry, bit my lip. This was the first entry. Let me take a sip of my drink real quick. This was the first entry in Eustace's diary. August 7th. Have now been 24 hours on this ghastly boat, if it isn't a dream. All the time, a frightful storm has been raging. It's a good thing I'm not seasick. Huge waves keep coming in over the front, and I have seen the boat nearly go under any number of times. All the others pretend to take no notice of this, either from Swank or because Harold says one of the most cowardly things ordinary people do is to shut their eyes to facts. It's madness to come out into the sea in a rotten little thing like this, not much bigger than a lifeboat, and of course, absolutely primitive indoors. No proper saloon, no radio, no bathrooms, no deck chairs. I was dragged all over it yesterday evening, and it would make anyone sick to hear Caspian showing off his funny little toy boat as if it was the Queen Mary. I tried to tell him what real ships are like, but he's too dense. E and L, meaning Edmund and Lucy, of course, didn't back me up. I suppose a kid like L, Lucy, doesn't realize the danger, and E, Edmund, is buttering up C, Caspian, as everyone does here. They call him a king. I said I was a Republican, but he had to ask me what that meant. He doesn't seem to know anything at all. Needless to say, I've been put in the worst cabin of the boat, a perfect dungeon, and Lucy has been given a whole room on deck to herself. Almost a nice room compared with the rest of this place. C says that's because she's a girl. I tried to make him see what Alberta says, that all that sort of thing is really lowering girls, but he was too dense. Still, he might see that I shall be ill if I'm kept in that hole any longer. E says we mustn't grumble because C is sharing it with us himself to make room for L. As if that didn't make it more crowded and far worse. Nearly forgot to say that there is also a kind of mouse thing that gives everyone the most frightful cheek. The others can put up with it if they like, but I shall twist his tail pretty soon if he tries it on me. The food is frightful too. That was the end of his first entrance in the diary. The trouble between Eustace and Reepicheep arrived even sooner than might have been expected. Before dinner next day, when the others were sitting around the table waiting, being at sea gives one most magnificent appetite, Eustace came rushing in, wringing his hands and shouting it out. That little brute half killed me. I insist on it being kept under control. I could bring an action against you, Caspian. I could order you to have it destroyed. The same moment Reepicheep appeared. His sword was drawn and his whiskers looked very fierce, but he was as polite as ever. I ask your pardons all, he said, and especially Her Majesty's. If I had known he would take refuge here, I would have awaited a more reasonable time for his correction. What on earth's up? Asked Edmund. What had really happened was this. Reepicheep, who never felt that the ship was getting on fast enough, loved to sit on the bulwarks far forward, just beside the dragon's head, gazing out at the eastern horizon and singing softly in his little chirruping voice the song the dryad had made for him. He had never held on to anything. However, the ship pitched and he kept his balance with perfect ease. Perhaps his long tail hanging down to the deck inside the bulwarks made this easier. Let me show you the picture. This is the picture from beginning of chapter 2. So you see him right here. He's not holding on to anything, but his tail is just kind of hanging there. Okay, so he's talking about doing what he does. And let's see. Sorry, where was I? Everyone on board was familiar with this habit, and the sailors liked it because when one was on lookout duty, it gave one someone to talk to. So the person inside that mouth there is lookout duty. And you saw the lantern hanging below. Why exactly Eustace had slipped and reeled and stumbled all the way forward to the forecastle. He had not yet got his sea legs. Okay, it's explaining why he fell, and it's because he doesn't have his sea legs. Like, you know how you balance on a horse or you're on a rockety boat? You stay bent at the knees, right? And kind of move with the boat. Otherwise, you fall over, okay? Why he fell, I never heard. Perhaps he hoped he would see land, or perhaps he wanted to hang about the galley and scrounge something. Anyway, as soon as he saw that long tail hanging down, and perhaps it was rather tempting, he thought it would be delightful to catch hold of it and swing Reepicheep around by it once or twice upside down, then run away and laugh. At first, the plan seemed to work beautifully. Look, here's the picture. And you see how big Reepicheep is as a mouse, but what an ornery thing to do. Grabbed him by the tail and swung him around upside down a few times. At first, the plan seemed to work beautifully. The mouse was not much heavier than a very large cat. Eustace had him off the rail in a trice, and very silly he looked, thought Eustace, with his little limbs all splayed out and his mouth open. But unfortunately, Reepicheep, who had fought for his life many a time, never lost his head even for a moment, nor his skill. It is not very easy to draw one's sword when one is swinging around in the air by one's tail, but he did. And the next thing Eustace knew was 2 agonizing jabs in the hand, which made him let go of the tail. And the next thing after that was that the mouse had picked itself up again as if it were a ball bouncing off the deck, and there it was facing him. And a horrid, long, bright, sharp thing like a skewer was waving to and fro within an inch of his stomach. This doesn't count as below the belt for mice in Narnia because they can hardly be expected to reach higher. Stop it, sputtered Eustace. Go away. Put that thing away. It's not safe. Stop it, I say. I'll tell Caspian. I'll have you muzzled and tied up. Why do you not draw your own sword, poltroon? Cheeped the mouse. Draw and fight, or I'll beat you black and blue with the flat. So he's talking about, if you don't have a point, I'm going to turn this around and hit you with the handle. That's the flat. I haven't got one, said Eustace. I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in fighting. Do I understand, said Reepicheep, withdrawing his sword for a moment and speaking very sternly, that you do not intend to give me satisfaction? I don't know what you mean, said Eustace, nursing his hand. If you don't know how to take a joke, then I shan't bother my head about you. Then take that, said Reepicheep, and that, to teach you manners, and respect due to a knight, and a mouse's tail. And with each word he gave Eustace a blow with the side of his rapier, which was fine, dwarf-tempered steel, and as supple and effective as a birch rod, meaning a switch, like a stick. Eustace, of course, was at a school where they didn't have corporal punishment, so the sensation was quite new to him. That was why, in spite of having no sea legs, it took him less than a minute to get off that forecastle and cover the whole length of the deck and burst into the cabin door. I still hotly pursued by Reepicheep. Indeed, it seemed to Eustace that the rapier, as well as the pursuit, was hot. It might have been red hot by the feel, meaning he was right on his tail. Reepicheep was right on Eustace's tail, chasing him, following him into the cabin. There was not much difficulty in settling the matter once Eustace realized that everyone took the idea of a duel seriously and heard Caspian offering to lend him a sword, and Drinian and Edmund discussing whether he ought to be handicapped in some way to make up for his being so much bigger than Reepicheep. He apologized sulkily and went off with Lucy to have his hand bathed and bandaged, and then went to his bunk. He was careful to lie on his side. What an ornery little brat, right? Okay, it's 9:51. We have 20 minutes. Chapter 3, the Lone Islands. All right, so this is what they expected to get to in the next day or so. Okay, all these islands are the Lone Islands, and if it's like any map, yeah, this is east. So they're going to visit the islands, and then they'll go east where they know nothing. They're hoping to find Aslan's world. Okay, I'm going to take a sip and then we'll go. Land in sight, shouted the man in the bows. Lucy, who had been talking to Prince on the poop, remember the poop is the poop deck, came pattering down the ladder and raced forward. As she went, she was joined by Edmund, and they found Caspian, Drinian, and Reepicheep already on the forecastle. It was a coldish morning, the sky very pale, and the sea very dark blue with little white caps of foam. And there, a little way off on the starboard bow, was the nearest of the Lone Islands, Fellameth, like a low green hill in the sea, and behind it, further off, the gray slopes of its sister, Durn. Same old Fellameth, same old Durn, with an N, said Lucy, clapping her hands. Oh, here's a better map. Oh, Edmund, how long it is since you and I saw them last. Okay, here's a better size map. Oh, and you see the E for east. Okay, so they're heading first to Fellameth. Durn is larger, and then Avra. All right. I've never understood why they belong to Narnia, said Caspian. Did Peter the High King conquer them? Oh no, said Edmund. They were Narnian before our time, in the days of the White Witch. By the way, I have never yet heard how these remote islands became attached to the crown of Narnia. If I ever do, and if the story is at all interesting, I may put it in some other book. So that's the author or narrator saying as much. Hang on, sorry, I need a sip. Are we to put it in here, sire? Asked Drinian. I shouldn't think it would be much good landing on Fellameth, said Edmund. It was almost uninhabited in our days, and it looks as if it was the same still. The people lived mostly on Doorn and a little on Avra. That's the third one. You can't see it yet. They only kept sheep on Philemeth. Then we'll have to double that cape, I suppose, said Drinian, and land on Doorn. That'll mean rowing. I'm sorry we're not landing on Philemeth, said Lucy. I'd like to walk there again. It was so lonely, a nice kind of loneliness, and all grass and clover and soft sea air. I'd love to stretch my legs too, said Caspian. I tell you what, why shouldn't we go ashore in the boat and send it back? And then we could walk across Philemeth and let the Dawn Treader pick us up on the other side. If Caspian had been as experienced then as he became later on in this voyage, he would not have made this suggestion. But at the moment it seemed an excellent one. Oh, do let's, said Lucy. You'll come, will you? Said Caspian to Eustace, who had come on deck with his hand bandaged. Anything to get off this blasted boat, said Eustace. Blasted? Said Drinian. How do you mean? Drinian's the captain, remember? In a civilized country like where I come from, said Eustace, the ships are so big that when you're inside, you wouldn't know you were at sea at all. In that case, you might as well just stay ashore, said Caspian. Will you tell them to lower the boat, Drinian? The king, the mouse, and the two Pevensies and Eustace all got into the boat and were pulled to the beach of Philemeth. When the boat had left them and was being rowed back, they all turned and looked around. They were surprised at how small the Dawn Treader looked. Lucy was, of course, barefoot, having kicked off her shoes while swimming, but that is no hardship if one is going to walk on downy turf. It was delightful to be ashore again and to smell the earth and grass, even if at first the ground seemed to be pitching up and down like a ship. You know how it feels, that vertigo, when you get off of a boat and you've been used to the swaying, and then you get on land and you feel like everything's moving around you? That's kind of a cool feeling. I like that. Sorry, you guys. I keep. As it usually does for a while if one has been at sea. It was much warmer here than it had been on board, and Lucy found the sand pleasant to her feet as they crossed it. There was a lark singing. They struck inland and up a fairly steep, though low hill. At the top, of course, they looked back, and there was the Dawn Treader shining like a great bright insect and crawling slowly westward with her oars. Then they went over the ridge and could see her no longer. Doorn now lay before them, divided from Philemeth by a channel about a mile wide. Behind it and to the left lay Avra. The little white town of Narrowhaven on the Doorn was easily seen. Hello, what's this? Said Edmund suddenly. In the green valley to which they were descending, 6 or 7 rough-looking men, all armed, were sitting by a tree. Don't tell them who we are, said Caspian. And pray, your majesty. And pray, your majesty, why not? Said Reepicheep, who had consented to ride on Lucy's shoulder. It just occurred to me, replied Caspian, that no one here can have heard from Narnia for a long time. It's just possible they may not still acknowledge our overlordship, in which case it might not be quite safe to be known as the king. We have our swords, sire, said Reepicheep. Yes, Reep, I know we have, said Caspian, but if it is a question of reconquering the 3 islands, I'd prefer to come back with a rather large army. By this time, they were quite close to the strangers, one of whom, a big black-haired fellow, shouted out, "A good morning to ya." "And a good morning to you," said Caspian. Here we go. Here's the picture. Let's see. So there are 6 of them. All right. "Is there still a governor of the Lone Islands?" That's Caspian. "To be sure there is," said the man. "Governor Gumpus. His sufficiency is at Narrowhaven, but you'll stay and drink with us." Caspian thanked him, though neither he nor the others much liked the look of their new acquaintance, and all of them sat down. But hardly had they raised their cups to their lips when the black-haired man nodded to his companions, and as quick as lightning, all the 5 visitors found themselves wrapped in strong arms. There was a moment's struggle, but all the advantages were on one side. And as soon as everyone was disarmed and had their hands tied behind their backs, everyone except Reepicheep, writhing in his captor's grip and fighting furiously. "Careful with that beast, Tax," said the leader. "Don't damage him. He'll fetch the best price of the lot, I shouldn't wonder." "Coward, poltroon," squeaked Reepicheep. "Give me my sword and free my paws if you dare." "Whew," whistled the slave merchant, for that is what he was. Oh, sorry. "Whew," whistled the slave merchant, for that is what he was. "It can talk. Well, I never did. Blowed if I take less than 200 crescents for him." The Calormene crescent, which is the chief coin in those parts, is worth about 1/3 of a pound. "So that's what you are," said Caspian, "a kidnapper and a slaver. I hope you're proud of it." Now, said the slaver. "Don't you start any jaw. The easier you take it, the pleasanter all around, see? I don't do this for fun. I've got my living to make, same as anyone else." "Where will you take us?" asked Lucy, getting the words out with some difficulty. "Over to Narrowhaven," said the slaver, "for market day tomorrow." "Is there a British consul there?" asked Eustace. "Is there a which?" said the man. But long before Eustace was tired of trying to explain, the slaver simply said, "Well, I've had enough of this jabber. The mouse is a fair treat, but this one would talk the hind leg off a donkey. Off we go, mates." Then the 4 human prisoners were roped together, not cruelly, but securely, and made to march down to the shore. Reepicheep was carried. He had stopped biting on a threat of having his mouth tied up. But he had a great deal to say, and Lucy really wondered how any man could bear to have these things said to him, which were said to the slave dealer by the mouse. But the slave dealer, far from objecting, only said, "Go on," whenever Reepicheep paused for breath, occasionally adding, "It's as good as a play," or "Blimey, you can't help almost thinking it knows what it's saying," or "Was it one of you that trained it?" This so infuriated Reepicheep that in the end, the number of things he thought of saying all at once nearly suffocated him, and he became silent. When they got down to the shore that looked toward Doorn, they found a little village and a long boat on the beach, and lying a little further out, a dirty, bedraggled-looking ship. "Now, youngsters," said the slave dealer, "let's have no fuss, and then you'll have nothing to cry about. All aboard." At that moment, a fine-looking bearded man came out of one of the houses, an inn, I think, and said, "Well, Pug, more of your usual wares?" Okay, let me show you. Was there? Yeah, there's a picture here. I'm going to sip my drink. Well, that's too bad. Okay, so the innkeeper came out and said, more of your usual wares? The slaver, whose name seemed to be Pug, bowed very low and said in a wheedling kind of voice, yes, please, your lordship. How much do you want for that boy? Asked the other, pointing to Caspian. Ah, said the Pug. I knew your lordship would pick on the best. No deceiving your lordship with anything second rate. That boy, now, I've taken a fancy to him myself. Got kind of fond of him, I have. I'm that tender-hearted I didn't ever ought to have taken up this job. Still, to a customer like your lordship? Tell me your price, carrion, said the lord sternly. Do you think I want to listen to the rigmarole of your filthy trade? 300 croissants, my lord, to your honorable lordship, but to anyone else, I'll give you 150. Oh, please, please, broke in Lucy, don't separate us, whatever you do. You don't know, but then she stopped, for she saw that Caspian didn't even now want to be known. 150 then, said the lord. As for your little maiden, I'm sorry I cannot buy you. Unrope my boy, Pug, and look, treat these others well while they are in your hands, or it'll be the worse for you. Well, said Pug, now who ever heard of a gentleman in my way of business who treated his stock better than what I do? Well, why, I treat 'em like my own children. That's likely enough to be true, said the other grimly. The dreadful moment had now come. Caspian was untied, and his new master said, This way, lad. And Lucy burst into tears, and Edmund looked very blank. But Caspian looked over his shoulder and said, Cheer up. I'm sure it will come all right in the end. So long. Now, missy, said Pug, don't you start taking on and spoiling your looks for the market tomorrow. You be a good girl, and then you won't have nothing to cry about, see? Then they were rowed out to the slave ship and taken below into a long, rather dark place, none too clean, where they found many other unfortunate prisoners. For Pug was, of course, a pirate, and he had just returned from cruising among the islands and capturing what he could. The children didn't meet anyone whom they knew. The prisoners were mostly Galmians and Terebinethans. And there they sat in the straw and wondered what was happening to Caspian and tried to stop Eustace talking as if everyone except himself was to blame. Let's see what time it is. 10:07. Meanwhile, Caspian was having a much more interesting time. The man who had bought him led him down a little lane between two of the village houses, and so out into an open place behind the village. Then he turned and faced him. You needn't be afraid of me, boy, he said. I'll treat you well. I bought you for your face. You reminded me of someone. May I ask of whom, my lord? Said Caspian. You remind me of my master, King Caspian of Narnia. Then Caspian decided to risk everything on one stroke. My lord, he said, I am your master. I am Caspian, King of Narnia. You make very free, said the other. How shall I know this is true? Firstly, by my face, said Caspian. Secondly, because I know within 6 guesses who you are. You are one of those 7 lords of Narnia whom my uncle Miraz sent to sea and whom I have come out to look for. Argos, Byrne, Octesian, Restamar, Mavaramorn, or I have forgotten the others. And finally, if your lordship will give me a sword, I will prove on any man's body in clean battle that I am Caspian, the son of Caspian, lawful king of Narnia, lord of Cair Paravel, and emperor of the Lone Islands. By heaven, exclaimed the man. It is his father's very voice and trick of speech. My liege, Your Majesty. And there in the field, he knelt and kissed the king's hand. The monies your lordship disbursed for our person will be made good from our own treasury, said Caspian. They're not in Pug's purse yet, sire, said the Lord Byrne, for he it was, and never Lord Byrne, not Byron, Byrne. For he it was, and never will be, I trust. I have removed his sufficiency, the governor, 100 times to crush this vile traffic in man's flesh. My Lord Byrne, said Caspian, we must talk of the state of these islands. But first, what is your lordship's own story? Short enough, sire, said Byrne. I came thus far with my 6 fellows, loved a girl of the islands, and felt I had had enough of the sea, and there was no purpose in returning to Narnia while your Majesty's uncle held the reins. So I married, and I have lived here ever since. And what is this Governor Gumpus like? Does he still acknowledge the King of Narnia for his lord? In words, yes. All is done in the king's name, but he would not be best pleased to find a real live King of Narnia coming in upon him. And if your Majesty came before him alone and unarmed, well, he would not deny his allegiance, but he would pretend to disbelieve you. Your Grace's life would be in danger. What following has your Majesty in these waters? There is my ship, just rounding the point, said Caspian. We are about 30 swords if it came to fighting. Shall we not have my ship in and fall upon Pug and free my friends for whom he holds captive? Not by my counsel, said Byrne. As soon as there was a fight, 2 or 3 ships would put out from Narrowhaven to rescue Pug. Your Majesty must work by a show of more power than you really have, and by the terror of the king's name. It must not come to plain battle. Gumpus is as chicken-hearted a man and can be awed over. All right, you guys, we're on page 50. It's 10:12. So it looks like in our readings, we cover about 25 pages. Pretty clean. Page 50. All right, and let me cover this in. Let me unmute everybody, unless it's super loud in your background, then just tell me or mute yourself. Oi, that is loud. I was not expecting that. Okay.
Surprise.
I know.
Hey, no, I didn't get it. I had it.
Okay.
I'm coming up a lot.
I'm going to, Liz, I'm going to mute yours because that's kind of loud. So this is kind of exciting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Frank.
He's
got to go now. We've got an appointment.
Oh, okay. You got an appointment? All right, go get him. Thanks for telling me. All right. Bye, Frank. And everybody else, go take a good break. I'm going to go get ready for yoga. And thanks for being here. I'll see you soon. All right?
All right.